In the depths of human existence lies something that inevitably leads to the transformation of our inner world. An era is coming when the need for a deep understanding of human nature will become more acute than ever before. After all, the real danger that lies in wait for us does not come from the outside, but lurks within man himself. Paradoxically, we remain remarkably ignorant of ourselves. We need to delve into the study of the human psyche, for it is in it that the source of future troubles lies. Perhaps each of us is familiar with the feeling when some internal force fetters our actions, as if sabotaging our own aspirations. What if, behind the curtain of consciousness, there is a secret side of our personality that influences our every word, every thought? This mysterious entity, called the shadow, as defined by Carl Jung, is an integral part of our unconscious. It contains all those aspects of our personality that we reject or deny, repressed desires, instincts, weaknesses, and those character traits that we prefer not to notice. These hidden facets have a tremendous impact on our behavior and emotional state, often remaining unnoticed by our consciousness. So, what is behind the concept of shadow? How to learn to recognize its manifestations, and most importantly, how to curb its influence? The shadow, this dark underside of the human soul, appears to us as a modern spiritual drama unfolding in the depths of our self. We invite you to immerse yourself in this fascinating spectacle. Carl Jung, the great explorer of the human psyche, in his collection of works Psychology and Religion, emphasizes everyone carries a shadow, and the less we are aware of its presence in our lives, the darker and more all-consuming it becomes. Recognizing our shortcomings opens the way to correcting them as they interact with other aspects of our personality and undergo constant transformation. However, if the shadow is suppressed and alienated from consciousness, it loses the opportunity to change for the better. It was Carl Jung who introduced the concept of the shadow into psychology, defining it as an integral part of the personal unconscious. The shadow accumulates those weaknesses and shortcomings that are inherent in every person, but which he prefers to ignore and hide from himself and others. The formation of the shadow occurs under the influence of social norms, personal experience, and suppression mechanisms. From an early age, we learn what behaviors, thoughts, and emotions are considered unacceptable in our family and society, and we push these undesirable traits into the realm of the unconscious. For example, a child who is told that expressing anger is unacceptable may begin to suppress his outbursts of rage, thereby sending them into his shadow. Often the shadow is associated with darkness and negativity, but it also harbors positive aspects. In its depths, diverse qualities are hidden, dormant, untapped strengths and potentials. Ignoring these hidden resources dooms the personality to spiritual poverty, creating unconscious barriers that hinder the growth and realization of the positive principles inherent in the psyche. Realizing that everyone carries a shadow allows us to understand its profound influence on our lives. For a detailed study of the different types of shadows and their impact, it is necessary to turn to the concept of the psyche developed by Carl Jung. The ego, according to Jung, acts as a representative of the real person. As an illustration, we can give an example. If individual B is aware of individual A, but A does not know about B, then the ego is more on the side of C, since it has more complete information. In this case, A represents a split part of the personality. When it comes to the self, it should be understood that this is the empirical I, covered by the term ego. However, self implies a more holistic personality that surpasses the ego, since the ego consists only of conscious aspects. Carl Jung, an outstanding Swiss psychoanalyst, draws a clear line between the ego and the self, two fundamental concepts in the structure of the human psyche. The ego, according to Jung, is the personification of our conscious I, the part of the personality with which we identify in everyday life. The self, on the other hand, is a more comprehensive and integrative structure, encompassing both the conscious and unconscious aspects of our psyche, being, in essence, the core of the personality in all its fullness. The narrator shares a personal experience related to the realization of this concept. He recalls a strong dislike for a certain person, reaching the point of wanting to cause him physical harm. This episode makes him think about the nature of aggression and its manifestations in his youth. During the conversation, it turns out that violent thoughts visited the narrator infrequently, but in moments of anger he could resort to physical force. His physical power and the harsh living conditions in the countryside, where violence was commonplace, are emphasized. At the same time, the narrator admits that he himself was afraid of his capacity for aggression, so he tried to avoid conflict situations. As an example, he cites an incident when he was attacked by a group of people. In a state of anger, he displayed uncontrolled strength, whirling one of the attackers around and injuring the others, which forced them to retreat. This episode demonstrates both the narrator's physical strength and his capacity for rage, which could get out of control. In his youth, Carl Jung pondered his own propensity for aggression, aware of the strength of his emotions and physical capabilities. However, the fear of losing control over himself forced him to avoid circumstances that could provoke outbursts of violence. This was his shadow. Now that we have an understanding of this fundamental concept, it is worth examining the Jungian model of the psyche in more detail. In particular, the question arises of understanding the term persona. According to Jung, this concept has practical significance for clarifying relationships between people. He noted that patients, especially those who lead an active social life, develop a certain way of self-presentation. Thus, the persona is partly a consequence of the demands made by society, and partly a compromise between the true self and how a person wants to appear in the eyes of others. The persona is a complex system of behavior conditioned by both social norms and personal expectations and aspirations. In the depths of the human psyche, according to Jung, a complex game of personified structures unfolds, each playing its unique role in the inner theatre of personality. Among them, a special place is occupied by the persona and anima animus, acting as connecting links between the inner and outer worlds. The persona, like a mask, is turned towards society, defining how we present ourselves to others. At the same time, the anima, animus, are directed inward into the realm of the unconscious, shaping our perception of ourselves and the opposite sex. The ego, rooted in bodily experience, acts as the executive center of the personality, making decisions and directing our actions. Along with it, there is also the shadow, the dark side of our nature, storing the unrecognized and rejected aspects of our personality. Together, the ego and the shadow form the core of our identity, defining who we are at the deepest level. The anima, the feminine principle slumbering in the unconscious of a man, embodies his inner femininity, influencing his relationships with women and his emotional life. Similarly, the animus, the masculine aspect in the unconscious of a woman, shapes her interaction with men, determining her assertiveness, logical thinking, and ability to rationalize. Having outlined the Jungian model of the psyche in general terms, it is worth paying close attention to the analysis of the shadow, this mysterious and multifaceted structure. Jung distinguished two main types of shadow, personal and collective. The personal shadow is the dark twin of our personality, the repository of everything we deny in ourselves, everything we do not want to be. It includes unrecognized qualities and attributes of the ego, often manifesting as weaknesses, socially unacceptable character traits, or even malicious inclinations. This is the part of us that we try to hide from others and from ourselves, but which nevertheless has a huge impact on our behavior and perception of the world. In his writings, namely in Volume 9, Part 2 of Ion, the famous psychologist Carl Jung emphasizes that a close examination of the dark sides of personality, those very shortcomings that form our shadow, reveals their deep emotional nature, relative independence, and, as a consequence, their obsessive or even possessed character. Ignoring and not accepting one's own shadow is fraught with serious consequences for mental health and interpersonal relationships. A person may partially or fully realize their shadow, which allows the ego to some extent to control its manifestations. However, unfortunately, many people so categorically deny the existence of their shadow that their ego remains completely unaware of its behavior, depriving itself of the opportunity to restrain it. In such cases, the shadow gains full autonomy and bursts out in the form of uncontrolled outbursts of irritability and even cruelty. Jung emphasizes that mental events are not just abstract experiences, but real facts that must be reckoned with. By observing the flow of images arising in our inner world, we learn a certain aspect of reality, an inner universe that is an integral part of our psyche. The psyche, according to Jung, is a phenomenon inherent in living organisms and is an integral property of matter. Since our body consists of matter, we find that this matter has another aspect, the psychic. Close attention to one's own shadow reveals a whole range of positive perspectives. In Carl Jung's well-known work, Interviews and Encounters, there is a profound thought about the nature of the inner world. Observing the world around us, we see concrete objects, people, buildings, the sky. However, turning our gaze inward, we discover a dynamic world of images, a world of fantasies, which, despite their apparent ephemerality, are genuine facts. Jung emphasizes that the presence of a certain fantasy, a person, is as real a fact as any tangible object. It is fantasies that underlie human actions. They can lead to tragedy or inspire the creation of monumental structures. Every house, every thing created by man was once only a figment of his imagination. Fantasy is not emptiness. It is a reality of a special kind that cannot be ignored. Jung also emphasizes that the unconscious is not just a repository of forgotten or repressed memories. It is an active and powerful force that has a huge impact on our experiences and actions. Thus, our inner world appears to us as a sphere as real and significant as the external world that we perceive with our senses. In his works, Jung tirelessly emphasized the need to be aware of the shadow, both in the process of psychotherapy and in the daily life of a person, pointing to its projections manifested in various life situations. Contrary to popular belief, which presents the shadow as something exclusively negative, it can also carry a positive potential. Studying one's own shadow opens access to a whole range of valuable qualities hidden in the depths of the subconscious. Carl Jung, in his writings, namely in Volume 9, Part 2, presents the shadow as a hidden, suppressed part of the personality, often inferior and burdened with guilt. Its roots go back to the distant past, connecting us with the animal world of ancestors and covering the entire historical layer of the unconscious. Previously, the shadow was considered a source of evil, but a deeper analysis shows that it contains not only morally unacceptable inclinations, but also a number of positive qualities. Among them are healthy instincts, adequate reactions, a realistic view of the world, and creative impulses. A person cannot be whole by denying this part of himself. Thus, a fulfilling life requires not only the recognition of statistical truth, but also the acceptance of biological reality, reflecting the true essence of man, his feelings and experiences. These reflections reveal the Jungian understanding of the shadow and the self, emphasizing the need to recognize and integrate all aspects of the personality to achieve psychological integrity and harmony. In her work Man and His Symbols, Marie-Louise von Franz, a colleague of Carl Jung, reveals the essence of the process of individuation and awareness of the shadow. She emphasizes that the shadow is not always an antagonist, but rather a part of the personality that requires acceptance and understanding. Like relationships with other people, interacting with the shadow involves being able to compromise, stand up for one's positions, and show empathy, depending on the circumstances. The hostility of the shadow manifests only in situations when it is ignored or misinterpreted. In everyday life, the shadow manifests itself through personal shortcomings that a person is able to recognize. These shortcomings, unlike archetypal manifestations, are not shrouded in mystery. Examples include greed, envy, laziness, untidiness, indecision, and excessive sentimentality. Such weaknesses are inherent in everyone, but people often prefer to turn a blind eye to them. Marie-Louise von Franz and Carl Jung emphasized that the recognition, understanding, and integration of the shadow, a complex and deeply personal part of the unconscious, play a key role in achieving psychological integrity and self-awareness. For a deeper understanding of this concept, it is proposed to visualize the shadow as a dark figure following a person. At first glance, it may seem frightening, but when faced with it face to face, there comes an awareness that it is just a part of oneself, needing understanding and compassion. The world of dreams also becomes an arena for encountering our shadow, which often appears in the guise of a person of the same gender as us. This character plays the role of a strict critic, an internal censor, mercilessly dissecting our shortcomings and weaknesses, plunging us into a state of confusion and awkwardness. Now let us turn our gaze to ways to integrate aspects of the shadow into our daily lives, using dream analysis as a tool for penetrating the depths of the unconscious. This process, known as shadow realization or shadow work, is a complex and painstaking work of self-knowledge. He implies engaging in lengthy and complex negotiations with his shadow, which can be likened to the psychological feat of Sisyphus. For those unfamiliar with the ancient Greek myth, Sisyphus was condemned by the gods to eternal torment. He had to push a huge boulder up a mountain, which, upon reaching the top, invariably rolled back down, dooming the hero to an endless cycle of suffering. Similarly, working with the shadow requires tireless effort and a willingness to accept inevitable setbacks on the path to self-improvement. By looking into one's own shadow, one gains the opportunity to observe its manifestations both in the external world, keenly tracking emotional responses and demonstrating utmost sincerity in relationships with others, and in the internal world, delving into the exploration of one's own dreams. Carl Jung, in his work Alchemical Studies, included in the 13th volume of his collected works, emphasized, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." However, this path, fraught with unpleasant experiences, often remains on the sidelines. As one deepens the understanding of one's own identity, a moment arrives when it becomes necessary to see the shadow in action. Awareness of its nature is of great importance and can become a fascinating journey of self-discovery. This process allows a person to approach enlightenment and reduce the destructive influence of the shadow, not by engaging it in open combat, but rather by directing darkness towards light and light towards darkness. In the 12th volume of Jung's collected works, Psychology and Alchemy, we find these words, "There is no light without shadow and no psychic wholeness without imperfection." No matter how frightening it may seem to confront one's own shadow, the discovery of truth brings long-awaited relief. Acknowledging the truth about oneself is a path to authenticity, requiring a thorough examination of the depths of one's being, studying one's possibilities and limitations, distortions and buried, often forgotten, parts of oneself and one's abilities. However, most of humanity tends to avoid deep analysis, even of those moral dilemmas they face in everyday life, let alone thinking about the influence of the unconscious on their actions. After considering the personal shadow, it is worth paying attention to the collective shadow, which is a combination of factors emanating from outside personal experience. The collective shadow is the dark, little-known or ignored aspects of society and culture, that which contradicts generally accepted values. For a deeper understanding of this phenomenon, it is necessary to consider its large-scale manifestations. Undoubtedly, there is a significant difference in the level of self-awareness between people. Some possess an amazing ability for self-analysis and understanding of internal processes. However, even the most insightful individuals cannot fully realize the content of their unconscious. For example, a person may not realize that while he lives a conscious life, a drama is unfolding in his unconscious, rooted in the depths of centuries. It is about the flow of archetypal ideas passing through a person through time. This continuous flow manifests itself in large-scale movements, such as political or spiritual ones. Thus, in the period preceding the Reformation, changes were brewing in society, the anticipation of which was in the air. An observant person, able to read the moods in people's minds, could foresee the coming transformations. For example, the author of these lines predicted the Nazis' rise to power in Germany, analyzing the dreams of his German patients, which with amazing accuracy anticipated future events. Like the essence of the shadow side, whether personal or universal, its presence and impact permeate all spheres while often remaining invisible. The universal shadow is reflected outwardly in the form of cruelty, persecution, physical torment, disease, poverty, hunger, addictions, crime, the decline of civilizations and other calamities. At the same time, it can also manifest itself in the depths of the human soul, giving rise to such torments as self-loathing, neglect of one's roots and culture, despondency and a sense of helplessness, a thirst for revenge, so that others may also know a part of the suffering, and much more. The universal shadow is what in the history of mankind has been called evil. In the Christian tradition it corresponds to the devil, and he who is in the power of demonic forces loses his human traits, acquiring a demonic appearance. According to Jung, in response to evil, it is necessary to strive for self-knowledge and the achievement of integrity, which implies acceptance of the shadow side. Every person, as Jung asserted, must constantly be aware of what good deeds he is capable of and what evil deeds he can commit. In any society, there are common difficulties, worldviews, and other unifying factors that have a noticeable impact on its members. Affiliation with a political force or religious group can significantly influence a person's actions. As long as personal contradictions do not affect these aspects, they do not manifest. However, when an individual goes beyond the personal and encounters political or other socially significant issues, they face a collective problem and, consequently, shared suffering. A problem that has manifested in society can be defined as a shadow if there are signs of denial, blame-shifting, and evasion of individual and collective responsibility. In this regard, taking responsibility becomes a moral, political, and spiritual imperative. The courage with which people acknowledge and accept their shadow relieves others of the need to bear its burden. An example of this can be seen in the analysis of the consequences of large-scale historical tragedies, wars, genocides, the Holocaust, total oppression, etc., echoes of which are still felt today. Humanity has a long and difficult path of knowledge ahead in this area. Denial, often dictated by the desire to turn the page and leave traumatic events behind, is perhaps the most common and natural reaction. History knows many examples of attempts to comprehend the burdensome past through public apologies for supporting atrocities, acts of repentance, the payment of reparations after bloody wars, and pilgrimage trips to places where tragic events unfolded. However, how should we interact with the past to ensure deep and comprehensive integration of the shadow into the consciousness of society, rather than limiting ourselves to symbolic gestures from leaders or political declarations? Recalling and discussing what seems inexpressible in words inevitably becomes a painful test for victims and perpetrators, for bystanders and witnesses to what happened. Such a process can be considered successful and complete only when the full range of feelings, pain, anger, betrayal, suffering, and other emotions finds its expression and receives a response, and when responsibility for the actions is accepted. In the modern world, humanity is threatened not by natural disasters, but by acts committed by its own kind. Man himself has become the source of the greatest danger. The human psyche is where the main threat lies. What happens if there is a failure in the psyche? Modernity demonstrates the colossal power of the human psyche, emphasizing the importance of knowledge about it. However, paradoxically, society ignores this sphere, not realizing that the mental processes of an ordinary person are of great importance. Truth is not only the most preferable, but also the most practical way to resolve any difficulties. History knows many examples of when the collective shadow, manifesting itself in the form of mass psychosis, led to tragic consequences. One of the most striking examples is Nazi Germany, where ordinary people, succumbing to the influence of demonic forces, committed unthinkable atrocities, joining the ranks of the Nazi Party and committing acts that they would never have committed under normal circumstances. In this context, the personal shadow becomes a kind of bridge connecting the individual unconscious with the collective. That is why it is so important to work on your internal conflicts and work through your personal shadow in order to avoid involuntary submission to the collective. By doing so, a person has a positive impact on others, benefiting the entire society. In conclusion, it must be emphasized that, to begin with, one should recognize one's personal shadow and enter into a difficult dialogue with it, showing honesty both to oneself and in relationships with others. It is important to carefully observe your emotional reactions and analyze dreams. This approach makes it possible to avoid the fate of a passive victim of one's own shadow and unconscious projections, awakening dormant positive qualities and improving life both for oneself and for those around. Showing courage in acknowledging and accepting one's own darkness becomes a source of relief for others because a sincere account of one's experience is the most effective way to combat a difficult past. Avoiding recognition of the atrocities committed only contributes to the growth of the shadow, which eventually reaches a critical mass, leading to the inevitable repetition of tragic events in